Welcome back to Operation Freedom, folks. I'm Dr. Dave Janda, broadcasting from our Freedom Bunker here at WAAM Talk 1600. Several weeks ago, I was contacted by a very high-ranking military leader. He was a general in the Air Force. And he said, Dave, I think you owe it to your listeners and to society to address an issue that has been completely misrepresented in the main, or as I call it, lamestream media. He goes, it's been deemed to be, quote, conspiracy theory. He goes, what I'm talking to you about is an entity called GeoEngineering or climate engineering. He goes, Dave, there's a war being conducted on the populace of our country and around the world from the sky, and they're unaware of it. And you need to let them know what's happening. He said, you need to contact an individual, and he goes, this is the top guy in the world in this. His name is Dane Wigington. Folks, I bring you today Dane Wigington. Dane has a background in solar engineering. He is a former employee of Bechtel Power Corp, and he has a background in renewable energy. Dane's personal residence was actually featured in a cover article in the world's largest renewable energy magazine, Home Power. He also owns a very large wildlife preserve next to Lake Shasta in Northern California. Dane has put all of his focus, efforts, and energy and intellect into geoengineering issue, which he began to lose very significant amounts of solar uptake due to the ever-increasing solar obscuration caused from jet aircraft spraying in the skies above his forest home. Dane also noted significant decline in forest health was occurring in his area and appeared to be accelerating. He initiated extensive testing and research into the geoengineering issue and commenced and has continued since 2002. He is a lead researcher for a great website. I encourage you to go there, geoengineeringwatch.org. He started in 2009. He's investigated all levels of geoengineering from stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, so-called SAG, S-A-G, to HARP. We've actually addressed the HARP issue with Dr. Nick Begich on this show. He has appeared on numerous films, radio interviews to educate the public on the extremely dire environmental and health dangers we face on a global level from geoengineering. Dane, welcome to Operation Freedom.
Thank you, Dr. Dave. Thanks for helping us address this issue that so few are even now unaware of.
So, Dane, let's get to the foundation, because I anticipate you being on the show on a number of occasions. First, for our listeners, define geoengineering, or what's also been called climate engineering.
Those terms refer to processes and programs designed to modify weather on a global scale and on a consistent and ongoing basis. And we have a mountain of documentation to prove beyond any reasonable doubt. Such programs have been going on for some 7 decades, ramped up along the way at many points, but there's many aspects to these programs saturating the atmosphere with electrically conductive, moisture manipulating materials, aerosols, radio frequencies that help to manipulate these aerosols. So the scope and scale of these programs, Dave, is absolutely immense, and so much so that few of us have experienced truly natural weather.
So, Dane, whenever you speak about this, all of a sudden you're awarded a tinfoil hat and being told that you're a conspiracy theorist, that these are nothing more than contrails that we see up in the sky with these checkerboard patterns occurring, that this has been occurring forever, and that these are, since the invention of flight, and a man-made flight, and these are nothing more than jet contrails.
On that note, again, with the quote-unquote contrail narrative, that's truly the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on humanity, and it's been implemented for so many decades that few people can break out of that paradigm. I would ask people to activate their sense of reason and consider that if you're in extremely cold weather on a cold day walking down the street and your breath is condensing, you don't turn around and see a cloud hanging behind you. And when we have film footage of these aircraft, military aircraft in particular, we have commercial aircraft filmed as well, but of these particulate trails, and these are not condensation, they're particulate trails, I ask people to consider what they see at air shows when they see the same exact type of trail being turned on and off. Mm-hmm. because a particulate is being emitted from the aircraft, which creates that trail. And the same process is going on with the large tankers and commercial aircraft. And we have film footage of these tankers turning on and off. We have up-close photographs of the nozzles mounted on the pylons directly behind the exhaust stream to make it look like quote-unquote condensation. And also, if people would look at the mechanics, if they'd simply research, all military tankers and all commercial aircraft have what's called a high-bypass turbofan jet engine designed for fuel efficiency. Mm-hmm. It's basically a jet-powered fan, and 85% of the air that passes through that fan is non-combusted. Those engines, by design, are nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under the most extreme and rare of circumstances. So, again, people are choosing to believe what it feels good to believe. None of us want to face the fact that we're all part of a massive and lethal experiment without our knowledge or consent. But quite simply, again, from congressional documents, 150 patents, film footage of these tankers spraying, lab tests from around the globe. I mean, we have mountains of data to confirm beyond any reasonable doubt. There's no discussion, or no debate. This is going on in our skies. Period.
And Dane, what are the compensations of these trails?
The composition would be what we know, and again, it's difficult to determine complete composition because unless you know what you're looking for, it's hard to find. You can't just tell a lab to test this and tell me what's in it. So we test for the main components that we know are listed in climate engineering patents, elements like aluminum, barium, manganese, even lead with some of the ice nucleating materials that are used, and those amounts are showing up in massive quantities. And to give your listeners an idea of my position in this battle, I've never been an activist, never been politically oriented, and this is the last thing I ever imagined spending the last 12 years of my life doing. Mm-hmm. But quite simply, when you do enough lab testing, and I've done several dozen tests of my own before I even decided to address this issue, that it had to be addressed. When we see aluminum in our precipitation mm-hmm. in such lethal quantities, and we've had an escalation, for example, over an 18-month period, from 7 parts per billion as a baseline, which was already high, given our locations in Northern California with only airflows off the Pacific. We saw our single rain events, Dave, go to 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum. This is highly toxic rain. This is in forested areas, no industry, no roads, no highways, no railroads, no airports. And quite simply, these are very lethal amounts of metals that match the climate engineering patents exactly. And when you know it's in the air column, you know you're breathing it with every breath. How does one not engage in such a battle?
So, educate our listeners, Dane. What are the effects of the spraying? What are the short and long-term ramifications on humans, on the environment, on our food supply and water supply?
To try to summarize, because again, that's a big question, yeah. And the effects are so widespread, so far-reaching, it makes climate engineering, mathematically speaking, the greatest assault against the planet and the web of life of all that the human race has ever launched. So to try to summarize again, there's very little in a negative sense that geoengineering doesn't do, from completely derailing the Earth's hydrological cycle, the rain cycle, mm-hmm. shredding the ozone layer, contaminating the entire planet. These particles are nanoparticulate size. They're so small, they're bioavailable to everything, to plant life. They easily enter through the human lung lining into the bloodstream, pass through the blood-brain barrier. Thus, we see everything we would expect to see with human health going off the charts. We see autism skyrocketing, and not to say again, when I talk about autism or Alzheimer's or a host of other human ailments, we're not saying geoengineering is the only cause. Of course not. But we're saying mathematically, it's inarguably the greatest cause by far, by sheer scope and scale. So we see autism, again, going from 1 in 5,000 in 1975 to 1 in 47 in 2014. Now MIT is telling us we'll have every other child with autism in less than 10 years. We see 1 in 3 seniors in the continental U.S. dying with Alzheimer's and or dementia, not dying from it, but dying with it. We see soils contaminated everywhere, and we have soil pH baselines. We see pH changes are the easiest method to track the saturation of these metals in the soils, because without a metals test for those specific soils as a baseline, the pH values are a more solid baseline, because we do have pH tests in most regions. So we've seen so much metal fall, for example, in Northern California, based on the USDA baselines, which we have. it's raised soil pH 10 to 12 times toward alkaline. Can you imagine how much metal it takes to do that? So we're seeing everything die, and that's a simple fact of the matter. And the bottom line is, from the ground up, from the base of the food chain up, we've seen in Northern California in a decade, Dave, a 90% decline in aquatic and terrestrial insects is measured by Forest Service biologists, 90%.
So here's the million-dollar question, Dane. Who's behind it and why?
Well, again, this is where a lot of people, Dave, tend to try to deny their way out of this because they feel that they, whoever they are at the top, wouldn't do this to themselves. And to try to refute that notion, first of all, all roads lead back to the central bankers. Always. Those who print the money fund everything, including the militaries. So, we can lay the blame there as the core, and we have too many examples of what this power structure has done, all power structures, to the planet, which is ultimately to themselves, from nuclear bomb detonations, surface detonations, detonations in space, the use of nuclear power, if you will. One facility that may kill us all, Fukushima, and we're building 60 more right now. The use of depleted uranium ammunition around the globe, which contaminates parts of the planet forever. So this is just business as usual for those in power who crave that power so totally that they ignore the consequences of their actions. And climate engineering, again, needs to be looked at as far as the why goes. It's the ultimate covert weapon of war, in which countries can be destabilized and taken out without them ever even knowing they were at war. And we have other aspects as well with this atmospheric spraying. It's used for DARPA weapons, electromagnetic weapons like EMP defense and offense, for electromagnetic pulse weapons, over-the-horizon radar. There's so many layers to what's happening in our skies, climate manipulation being a huge part of that. And if people looked at congressional documents, which we haven't posted, for example, on geoengineeringwatch.org, some 750 pages long, that outline their express goal to decide who got too much rain, who didn't get enough rain, basically to play God with the weather, which is what we would expect from those who crave such power. Right?
There are individuals, Dane, that say there's no evidence that this is actually occurring. There's no studies, there's no written evidence. And in fact, Dane, all they have to do is go to your website, geoengineeringwatch.com or .org. Dane, through some government sources, there's a 750-page document I'm aware of.
Correct. We have other documents as well. Again, there's an 80-page presidential document from 66, the 750-page document you mentioned from 78. This is what it comes down to, Dave. If people don't believe what they see with their own eyes, there's not much we can tell them or show them. They've made up their mind without the facts. And I hope people break that paradigm, because people are well trained to hear the, quote, conspiracy theory term and shut down no matter how much data we have. And I would, let's look at the, when it's the official narrative, when a conspiracy theory is the official narrative, people have no trouble with it, right?
Right.
So the official story on 9/11, the official narrative is a textbook conspiracy theory, is it not? I mean, whatever people want to think about what really happened on 9/11, I'm only saying this, that the official story is a conspiracy. Nobody ever questioned it. But when you have, again, the mountains of data we have to back up the fact that global weather is absolutely being manipulated, if people throw a certain buzzword out, their rational thinking, their deductive reasoning seems to go out the window from very careful conditioning over decades. So I hope that changes, and I would ask people to consider this. Ask yourself, if you have the top U.S. military brass stating on the record, and anybody can look this up, that the climate disintegration is the greatest national security threat of all, does anybody rationally believe that the government is going to ask our permission to engage in climate modification programs? Of course not. And this is absolutely going on, and we have red flags everywhere. We have NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, telling us in the last decade, or from 2000 to 2010, the atmosphere was suddenly full of particulates, and they don't know where they're coming from, half of them. They can't identify this. We have global dimming now, which is the term that refers to how much of the sun's direct rays no longer reaching the surface of the planet as compared to 5 decades ago. That figure is at 25 to 30%. That is unimaginable. It takes an incredible amount of material in the atmosphere to block that much sunlight, and that's the express goal of solar radiation management, which is what we're talking about. Part of these programs to block the sun's incoming thermal radiation with a very narrow-minded and destructive mentality of slowing down a runaway greenhouse effect on the planet. But these processes do much more harm than any perceived good, but they're too invested in them, too much power being wielded. They're not going to cut back until we make them.
So when I was contacted by this well-known general from the Air Force, he has a background in actually weather recon for the Air Force. One might say he has been in charge of this in the past. And I said to him, General, of these trails we're seeing in the sky, what percent of them would you say are related to being these chemtrails? And he said virtually every chemtrail, every entity you see in the sky is a chemtrail. I said, from 0 to 100, what percent level would you give that in your own mind's eye of having done this for several decades? And he said, there's no doubt about it, 100%, right? He said they are real chemtrails. And then, Dane, I asked him, General, who is behind this? And his answer was essentially the same answer you gave, Dane. He goes, Dave, it's the globalist New World Order banking syndicate group that you keep talking about is behind it.
We can't not conclude that. I mean, this is, again, if people understood the effort that's going on right now to keep the dollar as the global reserve currency as long as possible, this is why so many foreign governments were taken out. Saddam Hussein wanted to start trading oil in currency other than dollars. You know, it's a big factor with his takedown. Same with Gaddafi. You know, and this is the funding that's needed to push these programs. But we also have, and it's important to remember, we have China and Russia involved as well. And this 750-page congressional document made specific reference to countries cooperating, normally adversarial countries cooperating in regard to climate engineering, because this is, of course, a cross-border issue. So, I mean, the collaboration and collusion with these programs is immense. And, of course, every country would use the same techniques to manipulate and control their resources, their populations, and again, this is a runaway juggernaut of total human insanity. In fact, the epitome of human insanity, to think they could interfere with Earth's life support systems and have anything but a completely negative result. And that's what we have. And we have so much of academia, Dave, that wants to speak out. I've been face-to-face with NOAA scientists that very timidly, off the record, stating that, you know, they all know this is going on. They don't know what to do. They have no First Amendment protection. And on that note, not only do government scientists have no First Amendment protection, now, as of about 5 months ago, we have all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees with a federal gag order on them. How big a red flag is that?
And if they break that gag order, what happens to them, Dane?
Well, I'd like to quote former CIA officer Kevin Shipp, whom I know, who has written a book called From the Company of Shadows, and he has he wrote an article specifically for GeoEngineeringWatch.org as to what the process is for those who break that oath of confidentiality. And the process is absolutely horrific. They are dragged through the ringer, and to the point where if their attempt to sound the alarm continues, I mean, the consequences become total. And this is coming from a former CIA officer. So we already have the Obama administration prosecuting more whistleblowers than all other administrations combined, but that's the tip of the iceberg. I mean, people who try to speak out about, especially an issue of grave importance like the climate engineering assault, we can only guess what happens to them ultimately, but I think we can all speculate with some accuracy on that.
I asked the general, and I ask you the same question. Do these people that are doing this realize that what they're ultimately doing is destroying human life around the world?
That's a great question, and one that certainly warrants being brought up. the answer, I would say, is absolutely no. They do not realize, or they don't want to realize that, and they are told that what they are doing is for the greater good. It's important for people to understand that. The compartmentalization in the military is immense. So you have, for example, even if anybody's seen the interview of the pilots of the Enola Gay who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, defending his actions when we now know that those people did not need to die. But I think for those involved, in order for them to retain their sanity and functionability, they rationalize whatever they do. They choose to believe whatever they're told, that these programs are for the greater good, the common good, so forth. So I would say with the evidence we have, we can say conclusively that the vast majority are told they're participating in something that's benevolent in nature, when the truth is these programs could not be more malevolent. There is no benefit in these programs for the overall good. They're completely derailing the planet's life support systems and literally contaminating the entire planet. And Dave, we have studies, for example, more red flags. Your listeners, I'm sure, know that the bees are collapsing. Mm-hmm. And what we have stated to top bee people in the country, there was a much bigger issue than the chemicals, which we recognize are bad, the farm chemicals. But we knew there was a much bigger issue. That issue is climate engineering, and we now have peer-reviewed study that proves the bees are dying because they're packed full of aluminum. Mm-hmm. The same metals that we're now packed with, same metals used in climate engineering patents, same metals showing up in our tests from around the globe. This is a 2 + 2 = 4 equation, and it's killing everything. We have studies on 1,000 whales from the most remote places on the planet as well. These are all available at geoengineeringwatch.org. Proving the whales have, quote, jaw-dropping levels of aluminum in their tissues as well. When you put 20 million tons annually, and that's the stated goal by the world's most recognized geoengineer, David Keith, that's an unimaginable amount of nanoparticulates to put into the atmosphere annually. It's contaminating everything.
So the people that are perpetrating this are told you're doing, quote, God's work, but if you talk about it, you will be destroyed and so will your family. Yet the people at the highest echelon, the Rothschilds, let's give them a name, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, that are overseeing and funding these programs and in charge, do they believe they're immune from this as well?
I think they're fully aware of the consequences now. But again, I would cite two things. One, if we look at study psychoanalysis of psychopathic behavior,
that's exactly
power structure. You know the scenario probably then, and there's a common thread with various forms of psychosis, and that thread is a near lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. So this leads back to the detonation of the nuclear bombs I mentioned, the nuclear power, depleted uranium, but also it appears they felt that they could play God with the weather for a much longer period without the consequences that we now face, because methane mass expulsion has been triggered in the Arctic. That's a planetary extinction event that's underway now. If it continues, none of us are going to be around a whole lot longer. The shredding of the ozone layer, the consequences manifested much more rapidly, I believe, than those in power had earlier convinced themselves. And now they're simply trying to hide and mask the severity of the issue as long as they can, while they're literally making preparations for total collapse with deep underground bases and so forth.
Dane, how can folks follow you?
GeoEngineeringWatch.org. No advertising, no politics, just data.
Dane, thank you for everything that you do. I truly appreciate it. Be safe, because the powers that be don't like what you do, just like they don't like what I do. But you know what? As long as it helps one listener, we're doing the right thing. Folks, thank you, Dane. Folks, until next week, this is Dave Janda signing off from our Freedom Bunker. Until next week, dream big and dare to fail.